Strange, but true stories. Tales from the light side, the dark side, and the other side. I'm Steve White. Scary stories are good all year round, right? But there is something about this time of year when scary stories are just a little bit better, a little bit creepier. The air turning crisp and costumed children and adults enjoying the season and enjoying being a little bit frightened on All Hallows Eve. Trees without leaves and the full moon casting eerie shadows. The wind making branches scrape against the window like bony fingers trying to get in. That pales in comparison to the terror that these people felt when they experienced something they still struggle to explain when they are able to talk about it at all. The following are stories sent to us by viewers like you. Disembodied voice. I was home alone when this happened. My parents had gone away for a few days and I had the house to myself. I grabbed a beer and was getting ready to watch some television. We had a pretty good-sized house and I was walking down a long hallway. I had the feeling that something was watching me. A shiver went down my spine and all through my body. Weird, I thought, but shrugged it off and continued heading to my room. Then I heard a slam. I couldn't figure out what that was. I went to a closet and grabbed a baseball bat. I thought maybe somebody was trying to break in the house. I made my way slowly back down the hallway, peeked around the corner and into the kitchen. The refrigerator door had been knocked off its hinges and was laying flat on the floor. How could that have happened? It wasn't an old fridge. It's not like the door was barely hanging on the hinges when I had just grabbed a beer from it no more than a minute before. I didn't move. I was freaked out by what I was looking at, and I was trying to make sense of it. I went to get the tools and reattach the door. It was a little beat up, and I was wondering how I was going to explain that to my parents. Again, I shrugged it off and went back to my room to watch television. A few minutes later, I'm sitting in my chair, forgetting about what happened in the kitchen, when the sliding window I'm sitting next to is pushed straight up. It made a loud bang, and I reached for my baseball bat again. I was waiting for someone to jump through it. I mean, how else could a window rise up like that if someone wasn't outside pushing it up? I looked out the window, but nothing was there. And I could tell that nothing had been there. At least, no physical presence had been there. I stood there for several minutes. I heard a growl near my window. I couldn't see anything. I was frozen in fear. But of what? It went silent for a few seconds, and then my TV turned off. I pulled back inside the house and I looked at the TV, and in the reflection, I could see a flame floating in the air behind me. Then I heard it. A voice, loud and clear, say, "Get out." I took off and ran with my baseball bat out the door without looking back. My sister lived a few blocks away and I ran to her house. I told her everything that had happened to me. She let me hang out at her house that night. The next morning, we went back to our parents' house. I walked in slowly with my sister behind me. I told her to be careful as she began looking around the house. She went to the kitchen. She didn't see anything wrong or out of place. There wasn't a dent or a scratch on the refrigerator door. How could that be? I had seen the damage the night before. It had been dented when it fell to the floor. When my sister checked in my room, she said my window was closed. I went pale and a cold shiver ran down my back. I slowly walked to my room where my sister was standing. I looked, and sure enough, the window was shut and latched. I know I didn't do that. She said she hadn't touched it. She looked at me like I had lost my mind, but I know what I saw and heard. Nothing has happened since that night, but it still makes me wonder what that thing wanted from me. A face in the wall. I was 13 when this happened to me. I have thought long and hard about this incident, and some may believe that my eyes or my mind were playing tricks on me, but I know what I saw and experienced. My family is Mexican-American. My mom, who passed away a while back, was very Catholic. She was always lighting candles to saints or for other people. I remember we would say a prayer every night before I went to sleep. There was a prayer that she would pray for those in purgatory. I remember that prayer and others very well. Anyhow, I grew up in a modest trailer community. It was my mom, dad, and I at this time. It's also important to know that our walls were wood-paneled. My parents worked in Mona, Utah, and it was about 2 hours from where we lived, so they had to leave quite early in the morning to get to work on time. After they would leave in the morning, I would hear whispering around the trailer, and I would just think to myself that it's the radio, or it's the TV, or it's the neighbors. I wouldn't let myself think anything otherwise. I would be alone and on my own from 6 in the morning until they returned around 6 that evening. I would go to school and then either have after-school activities or go to my best friend's house, or I would sometimes have friends over to my house. I just didn't want to be alone in the house. I always felt uneasy and scared of being alone, but I didn't tell my parents because I didn't want them to be upset or lose a shift at work. I would just spend as much time away or keep myself occupied as best I could. One day, though, I was home alone, and I saw something that I will never forget. I saw a face in my parents' bedroom wall. I didn't say on. I said in my parents' wall. I swear on my life, I swear to God and on whatever anyone wants me to swear on and upon. I'm shaking as I write this. I don't like talking about it. I've only told one other person, and that was my mother. I'm shaking because somehow I feel like talking about this will somehow summon it or whatever it was back to my house. I haven't seen it since, and I hope and pray to God I never ever do again. I came home right after school. It was one of those rare days I didn't have anything else to do. My friends were busy, and nothing was going on that afternoon at school for me. When I got home, I turned on the television, made myself a snack, and did some laundry. Some of it was my parents' things, so when the laundry was done, I went to their room to put their clothes on the bed. As I was walking out, I saw some movement from the wall. It was a face. Eyebrows, eyes, mouth. I only saw those 3 features. It lasted about 30 seconds, which doesn't seem like that long, but when something that terrifying and unexplainable happens, it seems like a lot longer. But it also gave me time to really look at what I was seeing. The eyes were blackened, but shaped like a human's eyes, and it seemed to just be scanning around the room. It was also moving across the paneled wall. And then, as if it had just noticed I was standing there, frozen in place, it looked right at me and smiled. To this day, I can't understand how it is possible. I really don't want to go down that road in my mind. I can't describe to you how scared I felt. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot. I just stared at it as it looked at me and moved across the wall. Now that I think more about it, it wasn't a face shape really, just the 3 features of eyes, eyebrows, and a mouth that I remember. And then it just receded back into the wall. I still couldn't move. I stared and stared at that spot for a long time after trying to make sense of what just happened. I slowly walked out of my parents' room. I remember just sitting down in the living room and trying to watch television as if nothing happened. That didn't work very well. I was in shock for a long time. I can still see those features in my mind, and it scares me to relive it by writing this story. I don't know if anyone else has ever had any experience like this before. I would be interested to hear of other accounts like mine. Other family members have stories about that house. They haven't experienced what I did, but after my mom passed away, my cousin came to visit my dad to see how he was doing. And my cousin saw my mom walking around the kitchen like she was cooking. I moved out at 17 and went to live in Provo. My dad sold the house sometime later to retire to Mexico. I doubt he told the new owners about any of the creepy activity. To this day, I cross myself and say a prayer every night before I go to sleep. The memory is still very vivid. I'm not very Catholic, but I do buy my Virgin Mary candles and my St. Jude candles and keep them by my bedside. I know people will dismiss my story. They will claim my mind was filling in the blanks or it was just shadows on the wall. But I know what I saw and experienced. I have had other experiences in other places, but this was by far and away the scariest moments of my life. I still live in fear that it will pop out of the wall again. Cold Ghost. I bought an old house that was a real fixer-upper. My sister moved in with me, and we both worked to update and improve the house. We always joked about it being haunted, but I was firmly in the skeptic camp. When I became pregnant with my son, work on the house, except for the nursery, was put on hold. Now, there was a natural gas heater in the dining room. It had a pilot light, and every year when it got cold, I would have to call the gas company to have someone come light the pilot light because I extinguished it in the spring. The heater was very old, but it and some ancient gas logs in the living room were the only heating the house had at the time. I was afraid to leave the pilot lit while the heater wasn't in use. I just thought it could somehow cause the old, dusty, dry wooden house to catch on fire. During the summer, we only had one window air conditioning unit, and it was in the dining room as well. This particular summer, it was terribly hot, and the AC was running constantly. Add to it that I was pregnant and I was miserable. On July 28th of that year, my son was born. We came home from the hospital to my old house and single air conditioning unit. One day in early August, I was in the living room with the baby and my sister was in the shower. Nobody else was in the house. I felt the temperature in the room getting warmer and warmer, and finally got up to check on the air conditioner and to hurry my sister out of the shower so that I could take one to cool off. When I walked into the dining room, I suddenly realized why it was so hot. The heater was running full blast. In order to turn it on, the pilot light would have to be lit, and a knob at the rear of the heater had to be pressed and turned clockwise. It was not an easy thing to do. I asked my sister if she had turned it on. She looked at me like I had three heads. "Why would I turn on the heater in the middle of the scorching hot summer?" she responded. We were freaked out by it, to say the least, but didn't worry about it too much. I turned off the heater and extinguished the pilot light. We both continued to try to come up with some explanation as to how that could happen, but it was just one of those things that couldn't be explained. A few days later, it happened again. Pilot light lit, knobs turned, and the place was heating up. This was beyond bizarre. I was completely confused as to how this could possibly happen even once, let alone twice. We really started to worry at this point. My sister speculated that maybe there was a ghost truly in the house. Not an evil spirit, but a friendly ghost who for some reason was afraid the baby might be getting cold. My mama instincts took over at that point, and even though I felt a little silly, I got up and walked to the dining room and spoke to it out loud. "Listen," I said, "I know you were trying to help, but I promise you, the baby is not cold. You are not allowed to turn the heater on again. I will turn it on if we need heat." It never happened again. Buried alive. My grandfather told me this story so many times that I feel like I lived through it myself, though I think the picture I have in my head would pale to the absolute horror that my grandfather attests to seeing. My family has always lived in the mountains of East Tennessee. Like everybody else in the area, we went to church every Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday nights. The church we went to was an old church with a history stretching back to the late 1800s. There was a graveyard behind the church, and then beyond that was the creek. My grandfather says that when he was about 20 years old, there was a tremendous rain and the creek overflowed its banks and flooded a portion of the graveyard. The flooding washed away a lot of dirt, and several of the coffins were dislodged. My grandfather went to help redig the graves and bury the coffins again. There was one coffin that was completely uncovered. Inside the coffin were the remains of a woman who had died in 1923. When my grandfather and another person he was working with were ready to reinter the body, they each grabbed an end. My grandfather lost his grip a little, and in doing so, his hand grabbed the lid and the coffin popped open. Now, my grandfather has never been a squeamish person, and the sight of a dead body in itself would not upset him. But what he saw inside that coffin absolutely mortified him. The woman had obviously been a redhead. There were strands still evident protruding from her skull. But he also noticed clumps of red hair in each of her bony hands. She had been buried alive, and in the panic and terror of realizing her fate, had ripped clumps of her hair out before she died in actuality. The lid was put back into place and the coffin lowered back in the ground, but the brief glimpse of this woman stayed with him for the rest of his life. This has been another edition of Strange But True Stories. Have you ever had a scary experience that you can't quite explain? A run-in with the paranormal or the supernatural that you hope never happens again? We would love to hear about it. Send us an email to strangebutTrueStories2@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of these stories in the comments below, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks to those who have. It is greatly appreciated. I'm Steve White. Thanks for watching. Until next time.